We're in Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45. We've been going through the story of Joseph. We've been going through the whole book of Genesis, but here in the last several weeks, we've been talking specifically about the life of Joseph as it's come up here in Genesis and all the things that he went through in his life, the incredible life story that Joseph had with all the twists and the turns. And so tonight, we're just going to look at a short 15 verses here in chapter 45 because it is really a dramatic moment in this story. And Joseph brings up a topic that is really pivotal for understanding how this all works together in his life and the life of his whole family, the whole nation of Israel. But first of all, it begs the question, I think, tonight, a few things. I want to just throw this out there, get our minds thinking this way. And that's this. Why do bad things happen to good people? The age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? That's a loaded question, isn't it? If you've been in church any time at all, you know that's a loaded question. Because number one, if you believe the gospel, there's no good people, right? We're all sinners, right? Every one of us. And we also know that bad things ultimately are a result of sin, which are a product of our sin nature. It's a product of the curse that came on humanity in Genesis chapter 3. But really, more than wondering why do these things happen, the question for us as Christians is, what does God do with the bad things that happen to us? This is the life of Joseph. It demonstrates that he is in control even in the bad times. Even when somebody sins against us, God is still in control. The ploy of man, of sinful man against us, does not thwart the plan of God. Sin is not the plan of God, but it does not thwart the plan of God. That's important. So as we get to this point in the life of Joseph, let me catch you up to where we're at, because it's been 2 weeks, and a couple of y'all have slept since then, and you might need a refresher, okay? So let's go all the way back to the beginning. You got this guy named Jacob, who becomes Israel, and he has 12 sons. And the youngest two are named Joseph and Benjamin. They're with his favorite wife of 4. And so he has these 2 sons, and Joseph, about the age of 17 years old, is the obvious favorite. His older brothers despise him. They can't even speak kindly to him because of their hatred, spurred on by their father's favoritism. And one day he sends the little brother, Joseph, out to go check on his older brothers out shepherding the flocks far from their home. They spot him coming a long ways off, and they seethe with anger. He's coming in a fancy coat that Dad made just for him. And so they start plotting and planning. They think, let's kill him. Let's just kill this guy and be done with him forever. And then their brother Judah speaks up and says, let's don't kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. We'll make some money, a little profit off of this guy. And then they do that. They take the coat that his dad had given, that fancy coat. They put some animal blood on it, tear it up a little bit. They take it back to their dad and let their father believe that his favorite son has been killed by a wild animal. And he grieves and mourns and wails, and they just lie their heads off to him. Well, Joseph goes into slavery in Egypt. He's sold into slavery to a man named Potiphar. He becomes the best, over all of Potiphar's house, the best servant in all of Potiphar's house. And everybody takes notice of that, especially Potiphar's wife, who is kind of a desperate housewife, if you will, okay? And so she propositions Joseph over and over and over, and he says, I won't do it, I won't do it. I won't sin against Potiphar, and I won't sin against God. No, no, no. Finally, one day, she grabs a hold of him, and he peels out of there, literally leaving his garment behind as he runs off. She holds on to the garment and tells Potiphar when he gets home that Joseph had tried to rape her, and so Joseph is thrown into prison. But not just any prison, right? He's thrown into the king's prison. the jail where the king would keep, or the Pharaoh would keep his prisoners. And in there, he meets two gentlemen who worked for Pharaoh and who had become disgraced, probably in an assassination plot. And they have these dreams one night and are distressed about them. Joseph interprets the dreams. He tells one of them, listen, all this is going to be behind you soon. You're going to be restored back into Pharaoh's palace. And when you do, you remember me. Remember me, that I told you this. And the other one, he's told, listen, it's not going to go good for you. He's going to be lifted back up to the palace, and your head's going to be lifted off of your body. And both those things happen 3 days later. And then 2 years go by. The cupbearer totally forgot about Joseph in prison until what? Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has a dream, and nobody can interpret it, and it's very troubling for him. And the cupbearer goes, oh yeah, I was supposed to tell you about a guy 2 years ago who, when I was in prison, interpreted a dream for me. And so they call for Joseph. He's in front of Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, these two dreams of Pharaoh. And here's the interpretation. Listen, there's going to be years of plenty. 7 years of plenty. Where you'll reap and harvest more than ever before. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And the 7 years of famine will be so bad, they'll completely wipe out the 7 years of plenty. This seems like the right interpretation of Pharaoh, and so he says, listen, I'm going to put you in charge. You're going to store up the grain here in Egypt during the good years, so that way, during the famine, we'll have plenty. So Joseph goes from being literally a slave to a prisoner to second in charge of the whole land of Egypt. He goes from Potiphar's house to the prison to the palace, literally. Nobody's over him but Pharaoh himself. And then one day, after the famine has started, and Joseph has stored up all this grain, one day, some foreigners come to get some grain, and he recognizes them. It's his brothers. His brothers coming from the land of Canaan. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him, remember? He's all dressed up like an Egyptian. And he doesn't speak to them in Hebrew, he speaks through an interpreter. And so he loads them up with grain, he puts their money back in their pouches, and he sends them off. Comes again, the same thing happens. This time, I'm fast forwarding here a little bit, okay? This time, he required, I'm trying not to give you every detail, but I kind of got to give a few details, don't I? They keep one of the brothers, keep Simeon. He keeps him. He says, you go back and get your younger brother, and I'll release this brother to you, because I don't believe you have a younger brother. But we know Joseph wants to see his little brother, Benjamin. And so they just leave. Jacob, they get home. Jacob says, well, forget it. I've already lost Simeon. Just writes off Simeon. Sorry, Simeon. But you're not taking Benjamin down there until what? Another famine. Now that the famine, they run out of food, and the famine gets worse and worse. So desperation drives the actions of Jacob or Israel to send even Benjamin down back to Egypt with his brothers. They load him up with grain after a big meal. Once again at Joseph's house, they send him off. Then he sends his servant to go chase him down because they hid a cup. Remember, a special cup, a silver cup in Benjamin's bag. So they bring them back to Egypt. And they stand there before Joseph. And in chapter 44, we have this really impassioned speech from Judah. Now, Judah, remember, it was his idea to sell Joseph off into slavery. And so Judah, in his speech, says to Joseph, listen, the cup was in Benjamin's bag, but don't hurt Benjamin. Don't enslave Benjamin. I'll be your slave. Release Benjamin for the sake of my father and keep me. I'll serve as your servant instead of Benjamin. So it's this incredible moment. You see a dramatic change that's happened in the life of Judah. And Joseph sees the love they have for the favorite son. They despised him when he was favorite son. But Benjamin, this new favorite son, they absolutely love him. And he shows this great concern for his father. For the sake of my father, release Benjamin. So Joseph got only contempt from his brothers, but they now are showing this great concern for him. For Benjamin. So we find ourselves in chapter 45, really at the height, at the pinnacle of this exchange. Joseph's going to reveal himself to them. Joseph, you can literally just see his emotions have bubbled up. I mean, just imagine the moment you see your little brother for the first time in 20 years. This little brother was a child, toddler, the last time Joseph had seen him. And he's come to Egypt now. I mean, just imagine how many times Joseph wanted to just reach out and grab him and hug him. And this dramatic scene unfolds in chapter 45, and it's literally the pinnacle of this story. And I think it'd be hard to find a more dramatic or emotional scene in all of the Bible than this one right here between Joseph and his brothers. Chapter 45, verse 1 says, Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all of his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. And also Pharaoh's household heard it. Now, real quickly, just so we don't skip over that, he sends all the attendants out of the room. And so presumably they're still in his house, in other rooms of his house. And yet he weeps so loudly, cries out so loudly that they hear it in other rooms of the house. But not just that, it says also Pharaoh's household heard it. So Pharaoh presumably lives in a different house than Pharaoh, right? Than Joseph. So just get the picture. Joseph cries out so loudly that people all throughout his house and down the block can hear him crying and wailing. He just completely loses it. He can't keep his composure. He can't hold it together anymore. His emotions get the best of him. He has this emotional outbreak, and he weeps so loudly. And here is the moment in verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, I mean, drum roll please, right? Here it comes. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Yeah, they were. Right? And here's what's crazy. As I study this, I think about this. Nobody saw it coming. Right? No, none of the brothers were like, "I thought that was him." Like, nobody says that. They are completely taken off guard. At this point, Joseph hasn't spoken to them in a language that they can understand. He's been speaking to them in Egyptian through an interpreter. He's dressed like an Egyptian. His face is shaved. They think their brother's dead. They've already said that in this story. So there's no way they're thinking that their brother, who they sold into slavery, is this high official in Egypt who's speaking to them. And this is the first time that Joseph speaks to them. I mean, wouldn't that be wild if you just were dealing with somebody that you didn't think spoke English, and then all of a sudden they started speaking perfect English? You would just be amazed at that. Not only that, they just revealed to you that they're actually your dead brother. Oh my goodness. Is my father still living? They can't even answer, they can't even process his first statement, let alone answer his question. They were terrified in his presence. So at first they're thinking, this guy's crazy. How does he know Joseph's name? And they go, wait, now Joseph did come to Egypt. He kind of sounds like Joseph. You know, if you put a beard on that guy, oh my goodness. You right? This is how, in their minds, you can just imagine. And then they're going, oh no. Oh no. We are in his hands. We sold him into slavery. Now he's second in charge of all of Egypt. Our lives are in his hands. He snaps his fingers, we're dead. And so they say, so it says that they were terrified in his presence. You better believe it. We messed up and we're in trouble. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me." And it says, and they came near him. But you know they didn't rush to come near. They reluctantly came near him. You just can imagine. "I'm Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt." Oh man, we are in trouble. That's what he starts with. He doesn't just brush their sin away. He doesn't act like their sin didn't exist. He acknowledges what they did to him. But listen, he says this, and now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. This is incredible. So he says, don't be mad at yourself, because you know they were kicking themselves for that decision right about that moment. He says this, God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. Now, what you're going to hear, and I'll just tell you ahead of time, the next 3 verses, he's going to say, God sent me 3 times. So right there, God sent me ahead of you. Verse 7, God sent me. And verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. So he's going to repeat that 3 times. It's very important. God sent me here. Verse 6, for the famine has been in the land 2 years, and there will be another 5 years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. 3 times. And so he says, listen, now, there's a terrible famine. It's 2 years into a 7-year famine. After 2 years of drought, you think, okay, next year it's going to rain. It's probably almost over, right? You're going to at least think optimistically. And Joseph says, listen, it hasn't even begun. We still have 5 years of this. It's going to get worse and worse. You've already run out of food twice, and we're only 2 years into this. Imagine in the next few years. But listen, God sent me here to do 2 things, to save life, to preserve life. So he's going to save his brothers' lives, his father's lives, and all their family's life. But just imagine all the lives in Egypt and in the lands around Egypt that Joseph saved by interpreting this dream, by setting up the storehouses in Egypt to be able to feed thousands of people, presumably, with this plan. So he's there to preserve life, first of all, and also to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Remember, it's important. It's not just a happenstance that God puts Israel, the nation of Israel, in Egypt. He does it for a specific reason. The Egyptians can't really stand the Israelites, and so they certainly won't intermarry with Israelites. That's why 400 years later, after they've been there, they've grown to a huge size, and it's still a nation that hasn't been assimilated into the Egyptian culture. It's still a standalone nation. This is all part of God's plan to keep the Israelites, and to preserve them in their preserve their genealogy, preserve their structure, to accomplish all his promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. It's all part of the plan to establish a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. So it wasn't you, it was God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So, is Joseph bragging? Yes. He's bragging on God, right? Because he says, God did this. He says, God made me a father to Pharaoh. That means like a trusted advisor. Like Pharaoh comes to me for wisdom, like a child would go to their father for wisdom. And I'm over his whole household. I'm the ruler over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh doesn't have to worry about anything in Egypt because I got it all taken care of, just like Potiphar had me taking care of his whole household, just like the prison warden had me taking care of the whole prison. I'm like that for the whole land of Egypt. Now, let's pause there for just a second. Joseph has this emotional outbreak. He tells them who he is. They're terrified. They're shocked. You sold me into slavery. It was your sin, but God used it. But it was really part of God's plan. Now, I want to take a pause here and talk about, in this moment, Joseph has a couple of options, okay? He's got his brothers in front of him. He could put them in jail. He could put them in the ground, okay? And they would deserve that. He could leave them in Canaan, send them back to Canaan to starve to death, which would be essentially the same thing. He could bring them back to Egypt. He could punish them, do nothing, or bless them. These are his options. And Joseph is going to forgive them and bless them. And I want to point this out because a lot of times we get these ideas of mercy and grace confused. So let me give you a little illustration. Justice, mercy, or grace. See, Joseph could have given him justice. That would have been what? A prison cell or the death penalty. He could have given him grace, or he could have given him mercy. How do we distinguish those two? Let me give you a picture. If you get pulled over by a police officer, because maybe you're going 100 miles an hour through a school zone. You get pulled over, and that officer writes you a ticket, or I don't know, at that point, maybe puts you in handcuffs. I don't know how that works. I've thankfully never been in that position, but I'd probably go to jail. You'd probably go to jail for that. If that officer gives you the ticket or he takes you to jail, that would be justice. And you deserve that, right? You would deserve that for sure. And by the way, that's their job, isn't it? That's the police officer's job. So when a police officer does their job, don't get mad because that is their job. If you get your house broken into in the middle of the night, you're going to expect that police officer to do his job and come save your rear end. So don't get mad when they do their job by pulling over your rear end, okay? That would be justice. That's their job. Now, if that same officer comes up beside you in your window and says to you, listen, you deserve a ticket, but I'm just going to give you a warning. That's how you would feel, right? Woo! That will be mercy. You deserve the ticket. You deserve the jail. But he doesn't give it to you. That's mercy. Now, if that officer comes up to your window and says, listen, I'm not going to give you the ticket. I'm not going to take you to jail. I'm not going to give you even a warning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load you up in my squad car, and I'm going to take you over here to this restaurant and buy you a steak dinner. That would be grace. That'd be grace. And so Joseph's options, justice, that's what they deserve. Mercy, he could just send them on their way and not punish them. Or he could extend grace. He could extend grace and bless him, and that's what he's going to do. He's going to extend grace and bless them. And so he acknowledges, here's how he's able to do that. Now, okay, you're in Joseph's shoes for just a moment. You're in his situation. And you think, well, I can't even imagine that. Okay, just imagine somebody in your life who has wronged you terribly, okay? And just go back to that moment, all right? They probably didn't sell you into slavery. It probably wasn't even as bad as this, but just put yourself in that position for a moment. Could you forgive these people? Could you extend mercy even, let alone grace? You say, well, I'll forgive them because the Bible tells me to, but I'm not going to give them any kind of blessing for what they did to me. This is what Joseph does. How is he able to do it? Yeah, because his perspective wasn't on their actions. He had a higher perspective. He zooms out, so to speak. He's not zoomed in on his problems and his circumstances and his situation and what you did to me. He's not zoomed in. He takes a moment and zooms out, and he sees how God used their actions to accomplish God's purpose. Now, does God work through sinful actions? Yeah, he does. Even through sinful action. Now, God doesn't condone sin. He doesn't ordain sin. Sin, listen, this is an important distinction. Sin is not God's plan. But God's plan is not thwarted by sin. Okay? This is the idea of the sovereignty of God. That even when mankind is sinful, God's ultimate purpose and plan prevails. And if you need any more evidence of that, just look towards the cross. Right? This is what we see in the cross. Where Herod and Pilate and the high priest and the Sanhedrin, were their actions in condemning Christ sinful? Absolutely. Were they guilty for their sin? Yes. And yet God, being sovereign over all things, in spite of their actions, used their actions to accomplish His ultimate purpose, which is our redemption through the cross. Peter says this, though He was delivered up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, you used lawless people to nail Him to a cross and kill Him. It was God's deliberate plan. It was according to His foreknowledge. And how did He accomplish it? Well, it was through the actions of these sinful men. Let me give you another example. This one always blows me away. You know what? David has a son named Solomon, right, who takes over the kingdom. He's the king after David. What was Solomon's mom's name? Bathsheba. You know that name? Bathsheba? Uriah's wife? The one who David committed adultery with? Her son, well, one son dies. The next son is Solomon, who takes over the kingdom. Like, why would God use, David had a few wives, right? Why would God use a child from the lineage of Bathsheba and David? And just right? God still uses even sinful actions to accomplish His ultimate purpose. It's wild. And Joseph understands this. It's all part of God's plan. God's in control. These men in front of me who did this to me, they were wrong, but they're not in control. God was in control the whole time and used even their sinful actions to accomplish His ultimate plan and purpose. Now, had they not sinned against Joseph, God could have accomplished His purpose without their sin. I firmly believe that. But God, knowing all things and being all-powerful and being sovereign over all things, used their sinful actions to accomplish His purpose. Joseph understands this. And if you understand this, then you can love your enemies. Because no matter what they do to you, if you understand that God is ultimately in control and can use what's even a curse on their part in order to bless you, then you can love them in spite of their evil intentions towards you. That's what He does. He zooms out. In our lives, all we can see usually is at most a page at a time. But God sees the whole book, right? So you just got to understand that in your situation, you may not see the whole page or the whole chapter, but you can trust the author of the book because He's in charge of all of it. This is what He does. So for us, like Joseph, if we're going to take something away, we got to trust God. Trust the Lord. How many times in your life has what you thought was a curse turned into a blessing? Just take a moment and think about that. 1,000,000 times. You thought it was the worst thing that could happen to you, and then in hindsight you go, boy, I'm sure glad that happened to me. Because if that hadn't happened, then I wouldn't have been ready for this, or I would have gone down this road. And I think I've probably shared this before, and so just forgive me, but when I first went to seminary, I was like 23 years old, and I had never worked at a church, never worked in ministry really, but besides college ministry, and I was just eager to work at a church. I was so excited. I was going to seminary, but at that moment, I had no theological education, no experience at a church, and I was a single male. And so no church wanted to hire me, right? Like, I checked all the boxes you're trying not to check in ministry, okay? I was just like, no. And so I went to interview after interview after interview, and all those questions. So how many years you been in seminary? This is my first semester. Okay, you could just see people checking the boxes. Okay, are you married? Nuh-uh. Okay, have you ever worked at a church before? Nope. All right, well, thank you. Don't call us, we'll call you, right? And I remember being so discouraged in that time in my life, and I'm going through Greek class, and it was so terrible and difficult for me and just really struggling. And it was so interesting that many of those churches that told me no or didn't want me or didn't want to hire me, I got to see what happened to the people they did hire. And one of those churches, it was an internship. And they hired a bunch of seminary interns. And I'm like, surely I can get an internship. And even that church didn't want to hire me to be an intern. And not 3 months later, that church completely imploded. The pastor had to resign. All the interns were fired. An associate pastor came in and tried to take over, and it just went terrible. And I would have been one of those interns that was fired. Another church, Little B church, middle of nowhere. It's going to be like a 45-minute, hour-long drive from a seminary. Needed a pastor. I thought, I could pastor this little church. And they didn't hire me. You know who they hired? Another guy in my Greek class. He was in my class. I know that because during class, he raised his hand and asked for prayer requests for his church. And I remember thinking, they hired him, man. I'm way better than him. You know, you're like, ah. And you know what? Same thing happened. Terrible church drama, this terrible, I don't even remember the details. He ended up withdrawing from school so he could try to sort out this problem at this church. And it was just like on and on. I kept seeing how God protected me from these. But in the moment, when they don't want you, and they won't even call you back, and you're going, God, I moved down here, I'm going to seminary, like, what do you want from me? In the moment, it feels like a curse, but really it's a blessing. How many times has that been true in your life? Yeah. Amen. I've said this before, you know, you find maybe somebody you used to date in high school on Facebook, and you might go, hey, thank you, Jesus. All right, thank you, Lord. That could have been bad. Not everybody ages that great. Anyway, so this is the perspective that Joseph has. It wasn't you, it was God. So I'm thankful to God. So let me keep going here. Oh, I better keep going, sorry. And here we are in verse 9. He tells them this, return quickly to my father and say this to him. This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord over all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen. Goshen was the Nile River Valley. It was plush. It was the best place to have herds and flocks. And you can be near me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, all you have, there I will sustain you. I'll provide for you. For there will be 5 more years of this famine. Otherwise, your household and everything you have will become destitute. Look, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can see that I am the one speaking to you. Tell my father about all my glory in Egypt and about all you have seen. And bring my father here quickly. Then Joseph threw his arms around his brothers, Benjamin, and wept. And Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. So he tells them, listen, return quickly, hurry. He says that, return quickly, and he says, hurry. Few reasons. It's a famine. Y'all are out of food in Canaan. Also, Dad is old, okay? And I don't want to miss out on seeing him because y'all took your sweet little time getting home, okay? Hurry up. There's a sense of urgency here in Joseph's voice. You hear that, right? And he says, go home, tell him this, I'll provide. I'll provide for you. Tell Dad, listen, Dad, you've been the provider all these years, and now, listen, I'm going to provide for you. He's obeying the 5th commandment before it was even written, honor your father and mother. I just want to mention that because I think maybe that's a situation that many of you all have found yourselves in when, you know, your parents raised you and took care of you, and then your parents got older, and then you had to take care of them, right? I know many of you have had that situation. Well, this is Joseph in that situation. He's going to provide for and take care of them. He's now the provider. And so Joseph throws his arms around his brother Benjamin finally and just weeps out loud. And he kisses his brothers, and it says after that, his brothers talked with him. They got 20 years of catching up to do. They don't know, he doesn't know how many kids they have. He doesn't know if they're married. I mean, a lot of that probably hadn't taken place by the time he had left. He doesn't know what's happened in a family in 20 years. That's a lot of stuff. And so they have a conversation about it. Now, I think there's some parallels here in what he says, in his sense of urgency. He says, listen, you think you're going to be okay, you think you're going to make it out of the famine, you still got 5 years left. You don't even know what's coming. You say, we'll make it, we'll be okay. No, truly, if you try to make it on your own, you'll be destitute. You'll be poor and helpless and naked. You'll have nothing. And what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make a change. You're going to have to leave your homeland where you're comfortable, the place that you're used to, and you got to make a change. And if you stay where you're at and you make no change, you will certainly perish. But if you make the change, you'll be taken care of. You'll be provided for. And not only will you be provided for, you'll be provided for lavishly. Tell him about my glory, he says. Tell him he's going to have the best land in all of Egypt. Tell him that I'll give him all the food. It's a famine. They're starving all around you. You'll have plenty to eat. Your children, everybody. I will take care of you. And he says, hurry. There's a sense of urgency because Jacob could still die before he even meets up with Joseph. There's a sense of urgency. Do you see the parallel there in the gospel message? We have to tell people, listen, you think you're going to be okay on your own without Jesus, but listen, if you stay the way you're at, where you're at, you're going to perish. You think you'll be able to make it, I'll be okay, and you don't realize you're poor, destitute, you're helpless, you are naked and miserable in your condition, and you don't even realize it. And if you don't make a change and leave what you're comfortable with to do something else, and that is to embrace Jesus, to step out of that lifestyle and follow Christ, if you don't do that, you're destitute. You're going to perish. And you better hurry. You better hurry. Because you don't know how much time you got left. You don't know what's going to happen between now and the time you finally decide to make that change. There's some parallels here. And so it says this, after that, the brothers talked, and they caught up, and they had this great reunion. I thought, as I was studying this passage, about another story in Scripture, and I'll leave you with this. I thought about the story of the thief on the cross. Do you see that? You got Jesus hanging on the cross and two thieves. And Jesus is dying for the sins of these two thieves. It's their sins that put him there. And they both make fun of Jesus, revile him. If you're the Son of God, save yourself and save us. And they laugh at him, mock him. But then at some point, that one thief realized this guy is the Son of God, and he's dying for my sins, not his. He's done nothing wrong. He's dying for all the things that I did wrong. He's dying for the things that put me up on this cross. My things put him on his cross, not his things. And he cried out for forgiveness. And Jesus said, what? Does he say, all right, well, you're going to pay for this? You say, okay, I'll forgive these, but no more. That'd be mercy. No, what does he give him instead? He says, today you'll be with me in paradise. He didn't deserve paradise, and neither do you. But Jesus died on that cross for the thief's sins, and he died for your sins and my sins too, that we could all be saved by his great sacrifice, that we could all have grace. And what a story of grace we read tonight.